Welcome back to the second episode of our Diversifying Leadership series. Our aim throughout the series is to provide a platform for individuals to explore unfamiliar areas and discuss topics across the D&I space to support those navigating adversity in their career journey and hiring processes, as well as inviting guests from across the life science industry onto our podcast to talk through their experiences and offer insights into diversity and inclusion. We'd also like to encourage our listeners to suggest topics that they would like us to cover with our guests. If you have any questions from previous episodes or topics you'd like to know more about, please comment below or get in touch with me directly. Now, this week, we are welcomed by the one and only Jane Myles, who is the current Programme Director at DTRA. So thank you very, very much for taking part in the series, Jane.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this series. I feel very honored, and I'm really curious to see what we get to talk about today.
Absolutely. And to give everyone a little introduction into myself and Jane previously, we were first introduced to each other on the TGIF DCT podcast, which I think was 2021, Jane, if I remember correctly. And then we've shared a couple from there and worked together on strategizing and conversing on life science industry news and ways in which we can help each other moving forward. So that's a little background into our relationship. But Jane, please do give an introduction to yourself.
Well, I've been working in drug development for a really long time, and I've been very, very blessed to get to work in that space from a whole lot of different perspectives. I studied pharmacology in university, having thought I wanted to be a doctor, and then realizing, oh, actually, this whole developing medicines actually impacts people in a much broader way than what I would achieve as a physician. And then I started working at Eli Lilly, which was really important for a bunch of reasons, most importantly because I got to learn about self-directed work teams and process reengineering, which turned out to be a fundamental throughout my entire career. Then I went to work at a tiny niche CRO, then to a huge European pharma company, then to a startup biotech focused in a completely different therapeutic area, which was actually leading a whole strategic imperative with a Swiss pharma giant. And then I went to work for a reasonably sized biotech called Genentech, which grew about threefold in the first 4 years that I was there, which meant a tremendous leadership shift, and then was acquired by Roche. Then I went to work for a big global CRO, so the niche CRO, global CRO, a tech startup, and now I'm working in this cross-industry consortium, which is sort of like a dream job for me because I get to talk to people from all those different perspectives. Someone recently asked me, well, what's your 5-year plan? And I literally just burst out laughing. It's like, don't have one, never did. And this person who's really well respected and highly accomplished said, how can you not have a 5-year plan? And I said, well, my plan was always to say yes. And by taking that plan, I have had the opportunity to do a lot of different things. And I call that out because you can't let your starting answer be no. It has to be a yes. Because yes opens doors and no just closes them.
Well, that seems like a very short introduction to what has been a long and illustrious career so far, Jane. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I think from conversations that we've had over the years, you were probably one of the main people that I wanted to bring onto this podcast, because I know that from the very moment that you joined the life science industry, it was for a very good reason. So thank you very much. One of the opening, again, a broad question to you is that you've always championed diversity throughout your entire career. So why has that been such a prominent factor for you?
Well, when I think about diversity and drug development, there are all the scientific reasons that it matters, of course, and I'm a pharmacologist, so you want to know what works, what doesn't, what do we need to understand about safety. I would say it was simpler than the science. It was more about giving people the right to choose and the decision-making power to really direct their own health care. And that was important to me because I'm a white female who had lots of opportunities in many, many ways. But I grew up in a place where I didn't have a lot of opportunities. And what I mean by that is, Yes, it was a university community, but it was a very tiny one. It was a very homogenous one, frankly. And thank goodness my parents didn't think in a homogenous way. They always were strong advocates of how an individual can make a difference and how important it is to allow people to speak and act in alignment with their values. What it translated to me in drug development as was patients need to know they have options and they need to have the decision-making power around those options. It can't be the doctors anymore. Of course, we need doctors involved, but imagine the shift in mindset. And this was about almost 15 years ago now, trying to flip the script over from only doctors should decide whether or not a patient can be in a trial to what if patients knew there were trials and could take them to their doctors? That changes diversity right there. They are still not the decision maker, but they're actively involved in the decision.
Absolutely. So with that mindset switch 15 years ago, what did you do and how did you channel that into your work and then into your career?
The most tangible thing was really starting to help people within the organization where I was working understanding, patients are actually very invested and interested, which now is something we believe holistically. But at the time, people were very unclear, and there were so many concerns about the use of social media, the need to report adverse events, the potential to recruit the wrong patients, taking the decision-making, all these obstacles. Eventually, I wrote a whole policy document with the help of experts in the field and included a whole bunch of cross-functional input from within the organization where I worked, and then took it to the corporate head of compliance and said, here's how we could use social media to educate patients and then include them in our research trials, which could be a game changer for the business, for people, and frankly, for the development of medicine. And I'll never forget the response to that, which was, I'll say shock and horror. Like, first, why would we want that? Second, how could we live with it? And third, not only don't we like it, but we're going to change the informed consent for every study we run now to say that any patient who enrolls in a trial under the auspices of X will agree to stop using social media for the duration of the trial. And it's like, no, you're not doing that. No, I can't live with that. And it felt a little bit like I was being really disruptive. But I said, frankly, you can't do that. It's about, the First Amendment in the US. You cannot overturn the First Amendment. And frankly, you're going to set us up to have a whole lot of compliance issues if you try to mandate this. So we have to find a way to manage these new tools in a way that aligns to our values, to the regulatory framework, and enables patients. So it wasn't a diversity play around racial or social determinants. It was a much broader, like, why can't we find a way to include more patients in trials and in doing so, change the diversity of participation?
Well, I think from the perspective of social media of taking such a climb back then to now, obviously they were very much in the dinosaur years of social media, and that no one really understood what it was going to become and how influential that is on everyday life now. So it's an interesting.
I laugh now. It's like, no, patient recruitment does actually include more than social media, but
Yeah.
No one is objecting to the use of social media now.
It's an interesting perspective to see how mindsets can change. How did you overcome the obstacle then? What did you do and how did you position it to say, no, we have to do this and then get that implemented?
Oh, there were a few things that happened. One was we took the feedback, revised our guidance a little bit, but really started to work with those objectors to help them understand what was possible and to better understand their position. It took a while. The other thing that was working in our favor, though, was that the business understood that it was time to make some holistic changes in the way that we were running trials, and frankly, how the company was perceived by patients as a whole. One of those most important factors, though, was that around that time we had a whole set of initiatives that were called Trials to Patients. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that work in a few different silos. And that work holistically helped people across the organization understand how trials were going to need to modernize to reflect life. It wasn't going to be a compromise on the scientific endpoints. It was going to be a shift in the way the design and execution of trials could better fit patients' needs and, how it might fit into their lives. I wouldn't say it was a smooth journey, though.
No, nothing worth fighting for ever is a smooth journey, I don't think, Jane. Otherwise, we would do everything and anything all of the time. You've obviously always had diversity at the forefront of that work with the patient engagement and patient recruitment for clinical trials. So how have you also put it in the perspective of your own career? Actually worked your way up with all manner of different types of organizations. I'm sure you'd have had all different types of bosses and situations in the past that have been some easy to overcome, some not so easy. So how have you channeled previous patient recruitment diversity into a situation where you can diversify leadership?
Well, honestly, that framework of start with yes was a big part of it. And in academia, there's a lot of focus and narrowing of looking around. That is the way that academics succeed largely. In order to go deep, you have to narrow your focus. I knew I wasn't cut out to be an academician because I just couldn't do it. I mean, my thesis advisor was constantly frustrated with me because I was on the Senate and I was doing this and that. He's like, just come and do the research. I'm like, yes, and. So the concept of yes, and was something that opened up to me when I got to leave the little community where I grew up and go to a bigger place. And I mean, like a little bit physically bigger, a lot intellectually bigger, a lot culturally bigger and diverse. Starting at Eli Lilly, my big first, oh, wow, was when I worked in this self-directed leadership model, which was an experiment within Lilly. And I was like, wait, they do experiments that are not just about research? So the experiment was, what if we had a framework where teams could be set up to work on specific goals, but they have to take care of everything. Like they have to take care of the resourcing, all of the decision making, conflict resolution, ordering supplies, and they are held accountable to both productivity and outcome goals. And it was fascinating because all of us were scientists, none of us were skilled in leadership. And in that little lab, it was a physical lab and an experimental lab. We had to learn it. And it was fascinating to get access to the resources and also the support models that enabled this. So I'm going to call out John Lechlater, who was a visionary to put that in place. And we all learned there are some things we're really okay at and some we were not so good at. So learning how to acknowledge that and call on each other was the first lesson in diversifying leadership, because I had been a perfectionistic, competitive soul to my core up until then. And then I had to kind of start releasing that model a bit to work effectively in this self-directed work team model. Then I realized, because I got to take those skills into this process re-engineering framework and total quality management, which tells you how long ago it was. But I was an outsider to their business. I was working with them on defining how these groups within manufacturing, how might you change your business to become a self-directed work team? What would we need? Because now the company was interested in experimenting elsewhere. The big aha I got there was actually not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone wants to be the decision maker. Not everyone wants to take accountability. Some people literally just want to show up and do what's expected. As an a person early on in my career, I was fortunate to have what I'm going to call mind-altering experiential labs to realize I have to shift the way I'm thinking, and that's going to give me access to a whole new set of skills and input from people who will help me do things that I can't do alone.
Perfect. And how would you say that that's affected you now then? Obviously, you mentioned earlier on that your job right now is almost the dream job and you get to interact with all kinds of different people all across the industry. So is that still something that you still implement today? And how would you say that for someone listening to this, how do you get into that mindset?
So way back in those days when I was in the early career stages, I remember my boss then said, "So what do you think about conflict?" And I said, "Oh, I hate it." And he said, "No, you don't actually. You actually thrive on it. You think you hate it, but I see that you thrive on it because those opposing ways of thinking and solving problems kind of get you excited. So you're not in it to just stir the pot. You want the opposing viewpoint." And now I would say it's not so much an opposing viewpoint model, but when I get to work with cross-functional teams within DTRA, that's exactly what I'm seeking. It's like, okay, so you're coming at solving this problem from over here, and you're living with these parameters over here. And how do we help you both learn the view and world of the other so we build something that can work for both of you? It's just that transparency and understanding of mutual need that I think fuels innovation and the adoption of new methods. What gets in the way is when we have preconceived notions or are operating in a black box of beliefs. So if I can just open the box enough for you to start thinking, oh, maybe my beliefs could shift, then we start making change.
Excellent. I think from the other conversations that we've had and different styles of leadership that we've discussed previously is that one of the ones that you mentioned was around situational leadership. What does that mean to you, and how does that affect the diversity on a board or leadership group of a company?
So I first encountered this concept when I was working at Genentech, and if you wanted to learn things at Genentech, the world was your oyster. So I signed up for a lot of classes. One of them was situational leadership. The interesting, mind-altering moment there was, oh, you mean that you have to adjust the way that you lead people depending on their needs? Huh. Now, that's very naive on my part, but when you're a new leader, I think you go into that believing I need to have all the answers. I am the person in charge. I need to make decisions. That's a very naive way of looking at it. This was a way to think maybe I do have the answers, but I don't have to share them. Maybe, depending on the needs of the other, I can shift how many answers I offer versus how many questions I ask. And so the situational leadership model was really about learning, are you working with someone who's learning new skills, or are you working with an expert who can teach you? Because you can be a leader of both if you just shift the approach you're using so that you bring the best out of the other. And that's really what leaders are meant to do. They're meant to enable people to operate at their best potential by providing them support and guidance, not necessarily answers. And by the way, Genentech was self-aware enough to know actually we have a problem because we tend to hire people with one leadership style, and we need to be more diverse in that as well. The reason that they were investing in this class was so that employees were not stuck in a box with a leader who only used one leadership style.
I think it just shows emotional intelligence to be able to manage situations with different people. I know that's one thing from my own perspective of managing lots of different characters, whether that's personality, their background, etc. There is no one way to manage people. And we've had training on how to manage. And I think that, again, another point that we've discussed is that there's lots of leadership teams out there which have got to where they are because they're fantastic in project management, they're fantastic in sales, they're fantastic in technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've been trained on how to deal with situations and manage people from all different backgrounds. So how would you go about teaching leadership groups on how to manage diverse backgrounds to get the best out of their teams?
Well, there's probably not one answer, but I'll give you my answer. So I believe in being an authentic leader. That comes down to integrity, but it also really is about being vulnerable. And this was another gift in another setting at another organization where I had the opportunity to work with very, very senior leaders who were self-aware enough and self-confident enough to be able to say, I'm not good at this. And to publicly say, I'm working on this and could use your help. Wow. That is not the way that things show up most of the time in political leaders. So I was not in a political leadership context, but that's how many of us define what leadership is. So if you can be authentic and understand, yeah, I'm actually really good at collaborating with people, but I suck at X, and tell people in a way that gets them on board to help you, that's huge. I mean that in a positive way. I think that most leaders, at least in scientific firms, get hired for their technical skills, just like you said. And actually investing some time, maybe in formal coursework or in coursework that you do on your own in a development plan, is really important, because the technical skills that got you into the role may not be the leadership skills that will enable you to thrive and advance what you want to achieve. I was in this little learning paradise and I took full advantage of it. I think things have shifted, and as we've moved to a more remote learning model, there's a lot more available on demand, and please take advantage of it, but also try to find a way to distill the learnings and synthesize what's coming up in a conversation, a remote one, an in-person one, whatever. But I think that for me, learning is not just about absorbing content. It's also making sense of it and thinking through how to apply it. And I can't get that in an online setting. I have to go explore it with somebody who's curious too. And I was speaking with somebody I think of as a great leader recently, and she was telling me how she implemented this in an organization where she's been working, because her team was getting asked to change their focus from one technical domain into another. They were all remote. So she defined a couple of books for the group to read and set up some parameters, like read chapter X to Y, and we'll have a conversation. And if you haven't read it, still come to the conversation. So they just did that about once every month, and it wasn't perfect, but she said it really helped them start to advance their collective understanding of how they were going to need to shift their mindset and skill set. They also got to know each other as people really differently, and they hadn't really taken that opportunity in a completely remote setting.
You mentioned earlier that you've always been a disruptor. So you've obviously worked your way up organizations, vice president level, now board level with a number of different companies. So have you ever found the way you look or the way you act or your gender, etc., has ever affected that?
That's a tough one.
It is.
Yeah, it did. Let's face it, I'm a girl and I'm a girly girl. And so that put me in a box right away. And I have fought tooth and nail to get out of that box my entire career, which doesn't mean I'm not a girly girl, but I'm also a nerdy girl. And so it was more about creating space for people to add who I was instead of reducing me into a box. And most of that was actually just by showing up and doing the work, right? It was fascinating to me, actually, William, because I have always thought of myself as an incredibly privileged person to have the opportunity to education and doing all the things that I have got to do. My son actually says, "What are you talking about? Like you fought against all odds to get all of these opportunities, and you work your, pardon my French, ass off all the time to prove your worth." So even that was a fascinating insight to me, because to him, I overcame insurmountable odds. To me, I was like, you just were given a platform and you are obliged to make the most of it. So even that tells me that there's a tremendous value in understanding and asking, how are you perceived? And then it's not about ego. It's like, oh, is that actually helping the mission that I'm on? The yes and fighting to get out of the box are probably the themes to take away here. Like, yes, I get to talk to a lot of people now, but it's probably not just because I look a certain way or I have a certain set of credentials.
And I think that's one of the biggest points as well, is that with that yes and mindset, it's all well and good having that, but if you get that opportunity by saying yes, it is making the most of it. I felt that myself with Apsida, for example. I joined as employee number one. When I was asked if I wanted to go, I was like, yeah, let's do it. We started off with laptops and Excel spreadsheets and built into now a boutique but global agency, and having the opportunity to speak with people like yourself and, share thoughts and ideas with leaders within the life science industry is not where I ever expected to be. I was a chef before recruitment. If the opportunity does come, got to take it with both hands, because I think you're a prime example of what you can achieve in that time.
I still feel like I have a lot to do. So this isn't from I have achieved what I aim to. It's more like I'm still on a mission to do a lot of things that I think will make an impact. And the other element that helps me through that, because frankly, there is a fair amount of work involved, is the growth mindset that came to me when I got to learn about Carol Dweck and her thinking, which is we are infinite vessels of potential if we don't require ourselves to be perfect. And that's a whole other thing. Like, I had to overcome that perfectionistic tendency. It doesn't mean you change your standards. It means that you understand that the learning that you will gain through the effort of trying to build something is as important as the thing you're building. Because you can keep iterating on the thing if you're willing to iterate on your mindset.
I think mindset in general is everything. I think that growth mindset is great, but you have to be in the right place to accept that you have to go outside of your comfort zone to grow. If you're not willing to accept that, then you're not going to be able to really take into account what an actual growth mindset is. What sort of mindset do you think needs to change at a board and C-suite level within the industry to really diverse options and opinions on how we can take companies forward in general, not just from a D&I perspective?
Well, as you said, I've recently joined a board. It's a patient organization board. And what I appreciated about that process was that the leadership of the board was seeking different experiences and different mindsets and being very intentional about it. Because as an organization, there's an understanding and a desire to shift the way this patient organization is behaving. I mean, the processes and access to materials, but also to actually be more inclusive to more patients. So they were thinking really deliberately about, well, we need some people who are going to be a little bit disruptive, and in a positive way, like disruptive for good. how might we use technology differently? How might we help people understand research and how they can participate differently? How might we actually go talk to the FDA about some of the variables they're using as endpoints and why maybe they need to diversify their thinking? So when I learned they were interested in all of those things and had this process, of course, I was eager to sign up. And fortunately, I was selected to help. But they were seeking disruption for positive purpose. And I think that's how that organizations and boards, C-suites need to think about this. Like, you can't have the culture of yes in your organization and grow. That doesn't mean that you can be a disruptor and never agree. But after you've had your conversations, heard all the input, the decision maker takes the decision. As a leader, you need to be on board with that decision, support it with your entire core, and enable the growth that as a group you have agreed to achieve. So the disruption is helpful when you're ready to put it aside and do the work of what you agreed to.
I really like that phrase, positive disruption. I think that's a really good way of bringing together different ideas from different perspectives to really make that change. So you've been a hiring manager, you've been on the other end where you've interviewed for positions. If you were to give a bit of advice for someone who is looking to grow into a different position at a different level, what bit of advice would we use as getting into a senior leadership role in the future?
I'll build on a theme that Dawn brought up. Go ask the people that you admire to spend some time with you. And it doesn't have to be in person. It doesn't have to be a formal mentorship. And it doesn't have to be, just stroking the other person's ego. It can be, I'm curious. I admire you. I'd like to learn the things that you have found helpful, or whatever you're trying to build. Like, I'm curious about why you took this role. What is it? Because it looks like it's really different from everything you've ever done. So if you are trying to grow or learn a new skill set or even explore something that you're curious about, just go ask somebody that you think might have valuable insights. Then you get to synthesize them into how you want to use them. But I agree with Dawn that people are pretty generous with their time and their thinking if you can make it easy for them.
Well, this seems to be a very common trend so far, is to be a mentee and to network. I think network has always been a massive aspect of personal growth and really getting out into speaking with people and listening to what they have to say, I think really does play a massive part in where people get to in their careers. Jane, thank you very much for joining us on our podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure, as I knew it would be, and it always is when we speak. So thank you very much for being a part of this, and hopefully we can reconvene and bring you back on in the future with other different aspects that we can discuss as well.
It's been a delight, and the offer stands. If you happen to watch this and you're curious as an individual, find me on LinkedIn. I'm sure we can find a time to talk about what's making you curious.
And I second that. Definitely do it. Jane is a wonderful person to speak with. So appreciate it. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in for our second podcast. As you may see, is a trend that we will be releasing one of these at the end of every month. So we have lots of different topics, and please do feel free to either message me directly or comment on our post for other aspects of diversifying leadership that you'd love to hear about and understand more about. But thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you. Being denied a referral to a trial kind of shifted my whole career path.